So before we begin our project, it's important that you have a working version of Autodesk Maya so that you'll be able to follow along with the project. If you've not yet installed Autodesk Maya, you can go to autodesk.com, direct to the products page, and look for Maya under the products list. Once on the Maya page, you can navigate to the free trial section, and there you'll be able to select your operating system and download and install the latest 30-day trial version of the software. Now, just a few tips for installation success. Be sure to select the Installation Help section before installing Autodesk Maya. There's a few things that you may need to do to prepare your system in order for a successful installation. So you can watch this Prepare Your System video, and it's very important that if you're using Windows that you disable the user account control. And this is for Windows 7 or for Windows 8. You have links available to see exactly how to do that. So once again, watch this Getting Ready, Preparing Your System video, and then you'll be able to download and install the 30-day free trial. So if you need to, at this time, pause the video, download and install Autodesk Maya, and then you'll be able to resume with this Quick Start video series. Here in Stage 1, we're going to create our 3D logo text. Let's take a look at a few of the tools and also some of the interface we'll be exploring here in Stage 1. We'll start by creating the text, and we'll use the tool from our creation menu, our text tool. We'll then take our text and we'll learn how we can modify our text from our channel box menu and also our attribute editor. Once we have text created in our 3D environment, we'll learn the hotkeys to be able to navigate and orbit around a 3D environment. We'll then create the eye, and we'll also learn how we can create symbols such as the heart we have here on the screen, and we'll then learn our transformation tool hotkeys. That way we'll be able to move objects, rotate objects, and scale objects in a 3D environment. So we'll learn several tools over this first stage that will help us to complete this logo, and we'll learn the proper workflow to creating 3D text in Autodesk Maya. So our first step will be creating our 3D logo text. Now the tools that we'll need for this will be found in our main menu, and logically would be in our creation menu, and we'll also be using our viewport panel, our perspective view, to see exactly what we created. So let's create some text. We'll come up to the creation menu, we'll come down to text, and we want to modify the settings of our tool. We can modify any setting of any tool by using this option setting box to the right of a tool. Now, if this is not the first time you've opened this tool, it would be good to reset the settings if it's not at the defaults. If this is the first time you're opening this, this is what the default setting should look like. Now here we can enter whatever text we'd like for our logo. Now I'm going to create the text I love 3D, and I'm going to stack I love on top of 3D. So any text that we'd like to stack, we can create as separate elements. So I'll just start by creating the text 3D, and then we'll create the eye and the heart symbol in a moment. Now next, you can see that we don't have a lot of settings with this option toolbox. The next setting would be selecting a font. So here you can feel free to be creative and select any font that you'd like. I'm going to select a modern looking font. I'll use Arial Black. Now a little tip here, when selecting a font that works well with 3D logos, select a nice bold font and try and avoid any cursive text. Cursive text may have issues and require more advanced editing to be able to output the 3D geometry. So we'll start with just some simple text in this example. Then for the size of your logo, around 12 is a good default size for the default scale of our scene. But feel free to explore different sizes and see how that looks on the default grid within Maya. So here I have my text font selected, the size selected, so I'll hit OK. And the last thing I have to decide is what type of geometry I'm going to output. By default, it's going to output a two-dimensional curve, but we can actually save a few steps by directly outputting to a bevel, which is 3D polygon geometry and even has a nice beveled cornered edge. Now, this does open a few more options and settings, but we're not going to explore these right here because really these settings, we don't understand what they would mean. We're going to modify these after we create the text, and we'll get a very visual display of what these settings do. So let's hit Create. That will create the text and close the Options window. So at this point, we successfully created 3D text. So now it's your turn to complete this step. So just a recap of what we did, we took a look at our main menu, we went to the Creation menu, and we went down to Text and selected the Option settings. Here we modified some of the settings to create our logo font, then we hit Create to output our 3D geometry. So pause this video, create your 3D logo, and then we'll resume. So now that you have your 3D logo, let's take a look at how we can navigate about a 3D environment and see the logo from all different sides. Now we have 3 different hotkeys to navigate a 3D environment. We can orbit, pan, and zoom. Now the hotkeys are very easy to memorize. We just hold the Alt key whenever we're going to navigate, so I'm holding down Alt on my keyboard. I'm right-handed, so I'm using my left hand to hold Alt. Now while I'm holding Alt, I'll left mouse click, and this will give me the orbit gizmo. So now as I left mouse click and drag, you can see I'm orbiting about my 3D logo. Now if I'm holding down Alt and I middle mouse click, I'll have my tracking or panning tool, and now I'll be able to pan left and right, up and down with my 3D logo. Likewise, if I hold Alt and right mouse click, I can now zoom in and out on my 3D logo. Now using these 3 navigation types, we'll be able to zoom in to the little nooks and crannies of our logo, look at it from all angles, and investigate from all different sides. So it'd be good to practice using these hotkeys and becoming very comfortable orbiting 3D space. Again, a good tip here is just always hold down the Alt key when trying to navigate, and then you can switch between left mouse clicks, right mouse clicks, middle mouse clicks to be able to get into those little tight areas as you're investigating your 3D model. So now that we can orbit or navigate our 3D environment, let's modify our 3D text and see how we can change the design. So to do this, we're going to take a look at a new menu interface, and that is the channel box and the attribute editor, which is found on the right-hand side of Maya. Now, whenever we select an object, we'll be able to see that object's settings. So by default, we're looking at the channel box, and this gives us kind of like an Excel spreadsheet data of what type of history we have with the object. Now, if we'd like to see a more detailed breakdown, we can switch over to the attribute editor. And getting started, I would recommend using the attribute editor because understanding the settings can be a bit easier when we're starting out. So within the attribute editor, we have different tabs, the history of our logo. Let's navigate and find the Bevel Plus tab. If you need to, you may have to hit the right arrow to scroll to the right to find your Bevel Plus tab. Now once I select that, here you can see those same settings that were found in our logo creation tool. So in our text tool, there's those settings. But now, as opposed to creating the settings before we create the logo, we'll be able to adjust these after we created the logo. And you can see this is a lot more visual than if we would have done it before. So here we have 3 main settings we're going to take a look at: bevel width, bevel depth, and extrude distance. Now with bevel width, you can see that we can adjust the width of the bevel amount or the depth of that bevel amount, and that's what gives that nice chamfered corner look. Then our extrude distance gives us the overall thickness of our logo. So feel free to modify your logo however you'd like to come up with your own design. I'm going to use a pretty tight little bevel to give a nice modern, clean look. So I'll do a bevel amount of about 0.02, and I'll do an extrude distance of 1. And here you can see you can click within the input fields, manually type in data as well, or if you'd like to use the scrubbers on the right hand side, you can use either option. So if I deselect my logo, you can see that that gives me a nice crisp edge along the side of my logo. So at this time, you can now complete the second step on your logo, and that's modifying the bevels. So just to recap, remember to select your logo, navigate to the attribute editor on the right hand side, find the Bevel Plus tab, and there you'll be able to work with the bevel width, depth, and extrude distance settings. So pause this video and then resume once you've modified your bevel settings. So now I want to create the extra letter, the I, and also the symbol of a heart. And we'll just use this for repetition for emphasis. We'll reuse the text tool. So I'll come back up to my text tool and I'll go to the option settings for the text, and now I'll input I. Now here's a nice tip if we're creating several elements separately. Now we can use this bevel plus, we can use these settings within the option tools, and this will really speed up our workflow, because if I select my object on the viewport, I can now see the attributes that I used for my bevel width, depth, and extrude distance. So here I could use bevel of 0.02 for the width and depth, and the extrude distance of 1. So I won't have to modify any extra elements I create. So if I start creating additional logo elements such as this I start creating extra letters all separately, all of those will have the exact same bevel and extrude settings. So I'll just undo and get the I back to the default position. So now I have my I. Now let's create a heart symbol. The cool thing about the text tool is we can also create symbols. Now I know that the symbol for this is a capital Y, and you can look at a character map to be able to see different characters for different font types, but I'm going to use Webding's font. And Webding's font or Wingding's font are different font types that actually create symbols. So you can actually use this font tool to quickly create symbols such as the heart. So I'll hit OK. I'll make sure that the bevel settings are all the same, and then I'll hit Create to create that, and then close the application. Okay, so now I've created my I, my heart, and the 3D text. They're all the right bevel and extrude, but the problem is they're all overlapped, and that's not very clean geometry. So let's fix this. Well, to fix this, we're going to need to use our transformation tools. So we're going to learn how to move, rotate, and scale. Now, one tip before we move, rotate, and scale is it's advised to always do this in a two-dimensional view. Currently, we're looking in a 3D environment. So let's take a look at how we can set up two-dimensional views. It's very easy. We can come over to our toolbox, which is this left-hand panel, and our default is a perspective view. We're going to switch to a 4-view layout. Now that we have geometry, you can immediately see what this is doing. Here we have our 3D perspective view. We have a top view, and look for the name in the lower center of each panel, and there you'll be able to see which view we're viewing. So we have a front view, and then finally a side view. So we want to align our logo. Here I'm going to use my front view. This would be the best view to align the different letters and stack those. So now that I'm in my front view, let's take a look at how we can use the Move tool. Now, the Move tool can be located over on the toolbox. So here we have our selection tool, Move, Rotate, and Scale. But I'm not going to use the toolbox to access these tools, because just like navigating, we're going to be transforming or manipulating objects 90% of the time. So it would be efficient to learn these hotkeys right away. And don't worry, we'll make this really easy to memorize these hotkeys. It's actually just the first 4 letters on your keyboard. So Q is your select tool, W is your move tool, E is your rotate, and R is your scale. So let's take a look at the move tool and how the move tool works. When I have it turned on, you can see that the gizmo is an X, Y, and Z axis, and that corresponds to this little tripod gizmo in the lower left hand corner of each of your panels. Now, how to use this tool: you just hover over an arrow and then left mouse click and drag. So that allows me to move my object left and right if I'm using my X axis, up and down with my Y axis, and forward and backwards with my Z axis. So let's practice using that tool by moving some of these logo elements so that they're not overlapped. So I'll start by selecting my eye, and I'll use the Y axis to move it above the 3D. I'll select the heart, and I'll use the X axis to move it to the right, and the Y axis to move it up. So did you notice that I used my front view to move the objects and not my 3D view? Now, why is that? Well, the reason is because in our 3D view, the view is really relative. So if we move objects, it might look like one thing, but as soon as we navigate, we may notice that our object is not where we expected at all. So it's advised then to use our two-dimensional views, because that constrains our tool to only move on two axes at one time, either up and down, side to side, or front and back, up and down, so that we never accidentally move on all 3D dimensions at one time. So this is a good, efficient way to work. You may have noticed that I can also move the Y and X at the same time by using the center of my move gizmo. So here I'll just line up my heart above the 3D text. I can use the grids to help me to align this, and then I'll pull the eye in, and I'll make sure that the height is approximately the same on the grid to create just a nice clean logo presentation. So you notice that I moved in my front view, but then I'll take a look at my work in the 3D view to see how this looks in 3D. Alright, so there I have my stacked 3D logo. So if you'd like to get a little bit more advanced with your logo, feel free to use the Creation tool, Text, and create separate elements for the different letters of your logo or different symbols, and then practice using the Transform tool to manipulate and move those around and stack your logo differently to see how creative you can get with your design. So just to recap, we used our Creation tool, the Text tool, we used different letters, and we also used Webding symbols to create the heart symbol. We then took a look at our transformation tools. We can access those by using the toolbox gizmos on the left, but more quickly or more efficiently we can use our hotkeys Q, W, E, and R. So that completes stage 1, creating our 3D logo text. Just to recap what we completed in stage 1. Well, we've learned about our viewports, our panels, and how we can change our panels between a perspective view and a 4-view layout, and why we would do that, why it's good to work in two-dimensional views. We also learned about our channel box and attribute editor. These areas of the software help us to see the settings and also edit those settings, such as the bevel plus amount. We learned how we're able to move geometry in a 3D environment, and also how we can navigate or orbit an environment using the hotkeys Alt left mouse, middle mouse, and right mouse clicks. We also created our 3D text using the Create Text tool from our main menu in the Create, and we came down to our Text tool and explored some of the settings we had available there. So in just a few minutes, we have learned a lot about the Maya interface, and we're already creating our project. And this sets us up nicely for stage 2, where we'll now apply shader materials and give some color to our logo. So before moving to stage 2, we'd recommend to save your scene file, and we'll take a look at a proper naming convention. That way you can reference back to the separate stages as you built your logo. So let's go to File, and we'll go down to Save Scene As, just like we would in just about any other software application. And I'll just use the naming convention 01 3D Logo. Now, it's very important that you use the 01, because as we get into stage 2 and 3, we'll use chronological order 2, 3, 4, and that'll help us reference the different stages of our logo if we want to jump back at any time. You can also see the location of where you could find this file at a later time. Maya creates a default project in your Documents folder, just in the default Scenes profile, and that's perfectly fine for now for this starter project. So I'll go ahead and hit Save As to save my project. So at this point we've saved our work, and now we can move forward to our next phase. Here in stage 2, applying shader materials, we're going to add some color to our 3D logo. Now in doing this, we're going to explore how we can apply materials and also how we can edit material attributes. So we're going to explore the Lambert material to begin with. We'll then take a look at how we can add texture to our material and have some nice control over getting a little bit more complex materials on our geometry. In doing this, it's going to teach us about a new menu within Maya, and that is the status line. In the status line, we're going to explore menu sets, what menu sets are and why we need to work with those. Once we're in our polygon menu set, we'll then take a look at normals and how normals can clean up artifacts on our geometry, and also UVs and how UVs help us control textures on our objects. In doing so, we'll also take a few test renders. We'll discuss what a render is, and we'll store a few images so that we can see the progression of adding materials to our logo over stage 2 of this project. So it was a lot of fun taking our grayscale materials, adding some color to those. So let's go ahead and get started. So whenever starting a new stage to our workflow, it's always important to create a new save iteration. So before I start, I'm going to go to File, Save Scene As, just like we ended in our last step, and here I'll call this iteration 02 3D logo, and I'll just do underscore materials. So that'll let me know that this was the material stage of my workflow. So now any edits that we make, we won't affect the original grayscale logo. So if we mess up on anything, it'll be very easy to jump back to this point of the project. Alright, so now let's give our logo some color. So what I'm thinking with my logo is breaking this into 3 different colors, having a white, red for the heart of course, and then for 3D, I'll give it a nice orange color to represent the 3D training colors. Alright, so that's what we'll do. So first let's start with the white. Now we can very easily create a material shader by right-clicking on an object. And when we right-click on an object, you'll see you get this pop-up menu, and there's a lot of different things we can do here. So let's not get confused by all the different options. We're just going to start with one single one, and that is assigning a new material. Now when I assign a new material, I get this pop-up box, and again, we have a lot of options for shaders. Maya is a very complete package tool. There's so many different options. We're going to focus on 2 types of shaders to create our 3D logo. That's all we'll need to create a professional logo. So we can use either a blend, and a blend will give us a shiny metallic looking surface, or we can use a Lambert, which will give us a nice dry looking material. Now I'm going to use a Lambert material so that we don't have any reflections or highlights on the logo, and then I'll use a blend on those bevels in the future to give a nice metallic finish along the edges. Now I would recommend trying this first, and then if you'd like to explore, try using different material shaders as well. But let's just start with a Lambert for our shader type. Now all a shader is really the material properties that make up the type of material on our object. So with shaders we can create things like rubbers, plastics, metals, glasses. So the shader is kind of the hub that we can edit all the settings such as the color, transparency, or reflection attributes. So in this case we'll start off by just working with the color. So you can see there's a lot of settings to our shader. And if ever you exit out and you need to find the Lambert shader again, the easiest way to do that is to select the object, right-click, and come down to Material Attributes. This will quickly direct you to the material attributes in the Attribute Editor. So make sure that if you're in your channel box that you do switch to the Attribute Editor so you can easily modify the shader attributes. Now to modify the color, I can use the slider wheel to change the value, but if I want some more color options, which I do, I can click on the color swatch and get the color palette, and here I have color wheels. Here I can type in the hue saturation value or the RGB. You can even use an eyedropper tool to click anywhere on the screen to take colors. So you have a lot of options for picking your color. Now with the eye I am just going to use kind of a grayscale, more on the white side of my color chart. So now that we've got that color, it's also important that we set up our naming convention. So I'll just call this my white, and I'll underscore for material so that we'll easily be able to find this material in the future. So now let's assign our heart color material. So we'll repeat the procedure. We'll right click, assign new material. I'll use a Lambert, and I'll rename my Lambert as my heart underscore material, and I'll click on the color swatch to change this to a nice red color. I'll use a nice default red there. And then we'll come down to our 3D text, repeat, rinse and repeat. We'll use the Lambert once more, our color, and we'll select a nice orange color in my color palette wheel here. I want a nice vibrant orange, represent 3D training. Very good. Okay, so there's a nice vibrant orange for myself. And then I'll just be sure to name this properly, so I'll call this my 3D material. And there you'll see it renamed it to D material for me. Maya doesn't like to start with numbers when naming objects, so that's fine. I'll call this my D material. Alright, so now I have the basic color scheme, and if I just maximize my perspective viewport, you can see that things look pretty good, but this isn't really the final quality that I may expect for my logo. Well, that's because we're just viewing our logo real time in a 3D environment. So things like lighting or any settings that we set with our material shader, such as reflectivity, is not going to be represented in our 3D viewport. Again, this is just a real-time render of what's taking place. When we start to work with lights and shadows, we're going to need to create what's called a render. And we could think of it as like taking a photograph and then having that image once it's processed. Now, to create a render, we just need to go up to our status line. And in the status line, we have these little clappers. And the main two that we'll take a look at right now is the first two. The first clapper opens our render view. And so this just opens up the rendering view without creating a new photograph or a new render. The second opens the render view, but it also renders the current frame. So since I have my perspective view selected, you can see that it actually took a snapshot and created a render. So this is actually the image. This is actually what the final deliverable looks like at this time. So just remember when we're working in 3D that our 3D environment is only a representation of our final view. We do need to create a render to process the calculations of lights, reflections, shadows to be able to see the final quality. Now, as we go through this process, we're going to create several different renders and see how this logo transforms as we add new elements. Now, something nice in Maya is we can use something called keep the image, and it's this little mountain icon here. And what this will do is store this image, so as we take future iterations, we'll be able to compare how that render looks to the past. Now, just to keep some continuity, what I'm going to do is come over to my panel toolbar, and I'm going to bookmark this camera view. What that means is if I move my camera, I'll easily be able to get back to this. So I'm going to hit this little bookmark icon on my panel toolbar. It's the third icon over. And now if I move my camera, if I want to get back to that view, I can go to the View panel menu. I can come down to Bookmarks, and there I have Camera View 1. So I'll go ahead and select that. And you can see that instantly moves my camera back to that same view. So that way we'll have some consistency when we take our renders to be able to make a comparison of how our logo is transforming. So that's our first step of applying materials and creating our render. So at this time, what you should do is create materials. Maybe you want to create one material for your logo, or maybe you'll have several different colors. So right-click on the object, assign a new material, assign either a Lambert or a blend material. Again, Lambert don't have reflections or highlights, and blends would be more metallic type materials. Assign that to your logo. Then right-click and go to the material attributes so you can edit the attributes such as the color or even the transparency there in the attribute editor. Then, once you've set that up, create a test render, keep the image, and also bookmark your view. That way, as we're adjusting the material attributes and later creating lights, we'll be able to make a nice comparison to see if we're making our render look better and make sure that we're not making any settings that regress the quality of our render. So pause the video, create your materials and create a test render, and then we can resume to the next step. Alright, so now that we have the materials for our logo, let's see if we can make the quality of the materials look a little bit better even before we add lights. Now, one of the first things that you may notice is that we have some odd shading artifacts, and this is an advanced topic. It's referred to as normals and has to do with UV mapping and our polygon geometry, but right now what we know is it doesn't look too good. So let's see if we can clean this up. It's actually very easy to fix. What we do is we select our geometry and we just use a simple tool that fixes normals automatically. So we don't have to get into the advanced topic right now of explaining what normals would be. That would be a good discussion for a later time. Now, this tool is found in our polygon menu set. So we're going to take a look at a very neat feature that Maya has, menu sets. Now, in our status line, on the very left-hand side, you can see this drop-down. Here we have different sets of menus. And as I change these menus, look at the main menu on the top. So as I adjust these, you can see that my menus on the back end actually change. So Maya has so many tools that we don't just have one main menu, but we actually have sets. We have a menu for animation, a menu for modeling, a menu for NURBS, dynamics, rendering. So you can see that there's a lot of tools within Maya. So we're trying to affect the polygon or our model and clean that up. So I'm going to navigate to my polygons menu set. So now that I've adjusted that menu set, now I have my polygon modeling tools. And the tool we're going to take a look at is our normals tool. Now for this to apply to our geometry, I just want to click and drag and make sure that all of my geometry is selected in my viewport. And we'll go up to our normals menu, and we're going to use the set normal angle tool. Now what this does is it'll clean up any artifacts that we have on our logo like that. Now at default the angle is 30. And 30 would probably work. You can see that it does clean up the artifact that we had there. If I undo, you can see that artifact, and when I apply, you can see how it cleans that up. But I would recommend using the angle of 15. I found that to be kind of the sweet number, the sweet spot, so to speak, to clean up a lot of artifacts automatically without having to do any manual cleanup. So adjust that angle to 15, apply that to your logo, and then close the Set Normal Angle dialog box. So there we've cleaned up all of those artifacts on the logo. So like I said, normals are an advanced topic, but the nice thing is we have a pretty easy one-click tool that cleans up all those issues that we had with our logo. And right away, if we return back to our bookmark, and I open up my render view and render, we'll be able to get a comparison and see how that just cleaned up the edges in my render. So using that normal tool improved the professionalism and gave me some nice crisp edges to my logo. So let's keep that image. So at this time, be sure to clean up the normals on your logo by switching over to your polygon menu set, using the normals tool, and setting the normal angle to 15 degrees. Remember to select all of your geometry when you apply that, and then take a look at the edges of your geometry and see how it cleaned up the artifacts for you. And then create a test render, because it's always rewarding to see how the quality of your render is improving. Alright, at this point we're going to move in and get a little bit more advanced with our materials now. So as opposed to just a boring plain color, let's see if we can give this color a bit of variation. And we can do this very simply by going to the material attributes. So I'll start with my 3D, since we have a bit more font here with the logo, just to demonstrate how this works. So I'll select my logo, right click, come down to the material attributes using the pop-up menu. And in the color, as opposed to just picking from the color wheel or using the color slider, here let's use the swatch tool. Now this is such a powerful tool within Maya, because here we can actually drive this attribute by using a file node or a different type of texture node. So here we could even plug in images, for example. So this is where Maya gets very complex, and you have a lot of control and mastery to create rusty metals and different types of textures like that. So we're going to explore the ramp tool today. So select the ramp texture tool, and by default maybe your logo will turn gray and you're wondering what just happened. Well, now that we're using a texture, we need to kind of ramp up our graphics card, so to speak. So to do that, if you navigate to the panel toolbar, come over to this checkered icon, and this will allow us to see textures on our geometry. So when it's off, we won't be able to see textures. That'll be lighter on our graphics card, and when we turn that on, we will be able to see textures in our viewport. So here we can see our textures, and now I can use this ramp to control how this ramp is being applied to the geometry. So now, as opposed to just a solid orange color, I'm going to apply this color orange, and I'll kind of change the variation a bit. So I'll select my color swatch, and I'll use that same orange from my color history that I had before. I'll come over to this black color on my ramp chart and select that little wheel, come down to the color swatch, and I'll use that same orange. But now, just to give some variation, I'll take the value and I'll darken this up a bit. And I like to do this with all my colors. I never like to use a solid color, because this will give a more professional look. The color will fade, so we'll have a variation of orange, and this will give a much more complex and a much more professional final polish rather to our material attribute. Now, do feel free to explore. You can change the type to a U ramp, which is horizontal. You can do diagonal, circular. So again, you have a lot of options to change how the ramp is applied to your geometry. I'm just going to stick with a V ramp, which is vertical, top to bottom. And you can even add additional colors in your color wheel by just clicking, or you can delete those by hitting the X. So again, feel free to explore and have a lot of fun with designing your own ramp texture. Now, just for a moment, I'm going to take this color and I'm going to turn this to black so we get a strong contrast, because I'd like to demonstrate something. Here you can see that the ramp is working on the front face, but if I look at the middle face, see how it's going from back to front? It's not going from bottom to top. Well, why is that? Well, this introduces a new topic that you'll become familiar with as you learn more about 3D, and that's the topic of UVs. Now, if you've never heard the term UV before, what this is referring to is texture coordinate space. Now that sounds technical, but to break it down, we're just talking about how a texture, such as a ramp, is applied to a 3D object. So here's how we could illustrate this. Let's say that our ramp texture is like wallpaper, and our 3D object is like an object, a wall that we're going to paint. Now, by default, we had selected just a color. So in the attribute editor, if I go to my material attributes, we had red paint. We painted our logo red. And if we painted a wall red, it doesn't matter if we paint side to side, up or down, the paint's going to get applied to the wall. And that's fine. Now, if we go to use a wallpaper, all of a sudden, it matters how we put the wallpaper. If we go side to side or up and down, the pattern of our wallpaper may change. So it's important to lay out how we're going to put the wallpaper or our texture on the object so that it lays out properly. So that process is referred to as UVs in a 3D environment. So in our case, UVs are not properly laid out. So we want to adjust these. So we're going to take a very simple introductory look at adjusting UVs to our logo. We're going to change it to just a front so we can get a nice top to bottom layout with our UV coordinates. So again, make sure we're in our polygon menu set, select the 3D object, we're going to go to create UVs, and in this case we're going to apply planar mapping. So we'll go to the option settings for our planar mapping. And for the planar mapping, we want to project from the front axis. If I look at my tool gizmo, or if I turn on my move tool, you'll see that the Z axis, or the blue axis, is the one that faces the front. So we're going to project from the front. I'll hit project, and you'll see how it gives me this gizmo now, and this is changing how my UVs are applied to the object. So if I wanted to tile, you can see my ramp is repeated several times. We're going to keep it at the default. I'm not going to touch this gizmo at all. What I'll do is as soon as I apply it, I'm going to right click on the object and just go to object mode. All that does is completes the operation, and then I'll click away from the object to finish that. So see how this applied proper UVs. Now you can see that my wallpaper texture, my ramp texture, is going from top to bottom. We go from a darker color up to a lighter, and it's not going from back to front anymore. So we properly mapped our 3D geometry. So again, that can be a complex topic, but again, just think of it the illustration of applying wallpaper to your object, and that'll give you a good introduction of what UVs are all about. Okay, so I'll go back to my assigned material. I had darkened the bottom color just to illustrate that point. I'm going to return that back to the lighter orange color that we had before. Now, since that's a complex procedure, we're going to repeat that a little bit quicker now with these two other operations, just to rinse and repeat that process. So I'm going to go to my material attributes. We'll come over to the color. In my swatch color, I'll select the swatch. We'll apply a ramp node, and then we'll assign the ramp color. Now again, you can see that we have bad UVs. My ramp is not being applied properly, so I'll select the object, create UVs, and the settings are already correct, so I don't even need to open the settings box. We could just go create planar mapping, and there you can see that now we have proper UVs. So to complete the operation, remember the steps. Right click, go to object mode, and select away from the object. So we'll edit the material attributes once more. I'll come back to this black color, and I'll just lighten that up to more of a gray. on the bottom of my object. Okay, rinse and repeat one more time to just really reinforce how that procedure works. We'll right-click, go to the Material Attributes. In the Color Swatch, we'll apply a ramp texture. See if you can think of the steps before I do these. This time I'll adjust the color first, so we'll apply the red history that we'd created. And in the darker color, I'll take that same red and then darken the value. Alright, so we get that nice red. Now, can you remember how we apply the UVs? Alright, select the object, create UVs, planar mapping. So that maps it properly. Then we right-click to go to object mode and click away to complete the operation. I'm going to come back in and edit the ramp now that I see the proper UVs. It looks like I need to move the darker color up just a little bit to actually see what's going on there. Alright. Very good. So I'll use something along those lines. So there we have our materials. We actually created UVs to map our materials. So let's go back to our bookmark camera just to finish things off and take a render to see how this changed the overall look and feel. So I'll create a render. And now if I render this and look at the previous renders I had, look how our logo is coming along. So now we have some interest, we have a little bit more color dynamics taking place with our logo, and we're ready to introduce lighting to our logo. So that completes our second stage of applying shaders and materials. So we learned a lot in this section. Let's quickly recap what we learned so far. So we first learned how to add color to our logos by right-clicking, assigning a new material. Once we had a material applied to the object, we then took a look at the shader properties, such as adjusting the color. We even took a look at how we were able to apply a ramp shader to the object. And that got us into a little bit more advanced topic of how we're able to apply UVs and control how our texture sits on our 3D object. Just to reinforce those steps, we applied it to the eye, the heart symbol, and the 3D, and took a look at how we're able to use that repetition to reinforce that. And also don't forget that we applied normals. So we selected objects and we applied normals to clean up any artifacts that took place on our geometry. Now while we applied those operations, we learned about menu sets. So that sets us up nicely now for stage 3 of camera and lighting. So just to finish off the stage, be sure to save your work in progress. Remember that we created a save scene of the O2 iteration, so be sure to save that once again before we move. Here in stage 3, camera and lighting, we're going to apply some lights to the scene and we'll progress with the quality over the duration of the scene. So we'll start out with something very basic and we'll work our way up and start to get a nice looking feel overall. So some of the tools that we'll take a look at. In this stage we're going to create a background plane and actually lay the logo down on the floor just to get a nice camera view. We'll then take a look at how we can create a camera in the scene from our creation menu. We'll look through that camera and assign our side panel to the camera, and we'll take a look at the resolution gate so that we can find out exactly how we're going to render our scene. Once we have our camera view locked in, we'll start creating lights in the scene. Our lights can be found again from the creation menu, and we're going to focus with point lights. With these lights, we're going to focus with the color attributes, intensity attributes, and also turning shadows on and off so that we can control the lighting in the environment so we get an overall, again, nice approach to the lighting of our logo. So now let's create the shot that we're going to create before we start setting up the lighting. So kind of setting the staging. Now here you have a lot of options. You can create a perspective view, you can create a straight-on view, you could even render from the front view for that matter. Now just to add a little bit more dynamic interest, I'm going to switch over to my 4-view layout from my toolbox. We've used this tool before. And in the front view, I'm going to zoom out and I'm going to create a background plane. That way we can create some nice drop shadows on my logo. So you can feel free to follow along with this step, or if you'd like just a logo in a black background, you don't have to create this background plane. Now in my polygon shelf, I'm going to create a new type of geometry we haven't created yet. I'll create a polygon plane. And we can create this very simply by left mouse clicking and dragging. And as soon as we release the mouse, it'll create that geometry. Now I'll just center this up on my logo approximately and take a look at this in my 3D view. You can see I created it nice and large, that way that if I look from different camera angles, I won't be able to see the background in behind, so I could assign a color to this. So the exact size isn't very important. I just made sure it was large enough that it would be larger than my camera view. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I could render from the front, but I'm going to try and lay my logo down on the floor. I think that'll just give it a nice presentation. You can feel free to rotate or scale your logo as well. And to lay this on the floor, I need everything, so I'm going to select all the elements by clicking and dragging. So I have my background plane and my logo. And if I try using my rotate tool, hitting E on the keyboard for my rotate hotkey, if I rotate right now, see how the objects rotate about their own central pivot? Well, that's not going to work for me. So what I'll do is I'll create a group so that I can rotate this as one single instance. So I can find my group tool in the Edit menu, and under Edit, I'll scroll down and find Group. You can see the hotkey is also Control G. So this just creates a single container. That way I can rotate everything as a single object. So I'll start to rotate this down flat on the floor. That way I can get a nice camera angle of it laying on the floor. And with my rotation, you can see it still has a slight angle. So here in either the channel box or in the attribute editor, I can type in an exact angle. And for rotation or typing in transforms, I like to use the spreadsheet on the channel box. So in the channel box, you can see that we're using the rotate X value. So in rotate X, I'm going to type in -90. So that way I just make sure that I'm at a perpendicular, a nice, clean, level floor laying ground. So now I'll be able to size up on my logo laying on the ground. And again, this camera angle is purely artistic design, so feel free to have your logo standing, lay it down on the ground, or maybe take a picture from underneath and see how that changes the look and feel of your final render. Next, as we get into the composition of creating our render and setting up lights, we need to be able to navigate about 3D space, but have a set camera, a camera like on a tripod, for example. And so to do that, let's go ahead and create a camera. Now we can create the camera from our creation menu. So that, again, very logical where we'd find that tool. So we'll go to Create, we'll come down to Cameras, and I'll just create the default camera type, just a standard camera. When I create that in my perspective view, you can see you get this nice little camera gizmo that we'll be able to take our renders from. And let's take a look at how we can actually look through this camera. So in our panel toolbar, I'm going to come down to my side view, and I haven't really used this side view. It's not too important to me right now. So we can actually modify our panels to be any view that we need. For example, I'm going to turn this panel into my camera. So in my panel toolbar, under the panel menu, I'm going to hit Panels, and in Perspective Options, here's the default perspective I see up here, but here's the camera 1 that I just created. So I'm actually going to switch to camera 1. And now as I navigate my camera 1, you can see how it actually moves my camera object in the scene. So you'll find that looking through the camera is much easier than trying to move the camera object and rotate it to get the camera view that you're looking for. So here I'll just size things up in my viewport so that we can create the render that we're looking for. Now again, just a recap from stage 2, we see our material textures in our perspective view, but we don't see those here in our camera view. So do you remember how to turn that back on? Well, just as review, we use our texture icon from our panel toolbar. So there we're able to see the textures that we've applied here in the view. Now, depending on the size of your monitor, the panels may be squashed or they may be elongated. It's really different between everybody's monitor. So when we create our render, we need to make sure that we're able to see exactly the image that we're going to produce. And we have a very simple tool to help us to do that. Again, it's found from our panel toolbar since we're modifying how our panel looks, and it's called the resolution gate. It's this little white square with a blue sphere icon. What this does is it brings up a marquee render region, and this shows us exactly that when we hit the render button, what the image proportions are going to look like. So I'll be able to see if we're going to crop any of our logo off in our final render or how things will look. So as you're setting up your camera, I'd recommend turning on the resolution gate so you can see exactly how the final render is going to look. So I'll just adjust my camera view, pick something. We may modify this a little bit later, but just get a default for our test renders. And now what's nice is as I set up lights or adjust my materials, I can navigate in my 3D scene, but I have my locked camera view where we'll be able to create our renders from. So to test that out, let's select our camera view, and we'll come up and hit the render icon. So there we've rendered, and you can see that the render view is coming from our camera. So this is our starting point before we create light, so let's go ahead and keep this image. And this is the first step, so go ahead and follow along at this point. Pause the video, and what you'll want to do is create your camera. So just to recap, remember we created our camera from our camera menu. Then in our panels toolbar, we hit perspective camera to change our panel to actually look through the camera. Then we used our orbiting tools using the Alt, left mouse, middle mouse, and right mouse click to align our camera how we'd like to render. And we use this tool in our panel toolbar, the resolution gate, to help us see exactly what the render region is going to look like. So once we've got all that sized up, we're ready to start creating lights and doing a few test renders. So now that we have our camera shot, let's create some lights and do some test renders. So to create lights, you may have guessed, again very logical, we can find any creation tools from our Create menu. So now I'll navigate down to Lights, and I'll come over to Point Light. We're going to use a point light. There's several different types of lights found within Maya. The point light is a good introductory light to the attributes that we can modify within Maya. So when I create a light, you can see it creates a point light gizmo in the screen, and it always defaults to the origin of my grid. So I'll just move this up initially on the y-axis by using my move tool. Again, we can access our move tool by hitting W on the keyboard, and then we can move that by left mouse clicking on the y-axis and moving that up. So there's the little gizmo that will be able to emit light from, almost like a light bulb, you could think of it. So to see kind of how this light's going to look before we do a test render, we can turn on our lighting mode within our viewport. And that's just found on the panel toolbar. It's the icon right beyond the texture bar. And now we can see lights in the scene. Now again, this representation is not going to be very accurate to the final quality, but it will help us get an idea. And that will speed up the process so we don't have to do as many test renders. So I'm going to come over to the attribute editor now, and with my light selected, look for the point light shape attribute. So this will give us the attributes to our light. So just like we edited the material attributes, now before I do any editing, let's create a test render to see how this light affected the scene. So I'll create a new render, and now you can see that with a light we're starting to get a little bit better quality already. We just have one light in the lower left hand corner of my logo. So now let's start adjusting some of the light settings. The main settings to pay attention to would be the color of the light. So for example, we can have a light that emits red colors, yellow colors, blue colors, or a clean white light. We can adjust the intensity of the light, the emission point, and we can adjust the decay rate. And here I'd recommend turning on decay of linear or quadratic based on the scale of the scene. What this does is it allows light to die off the further we get away from the source, and that's true to the real world. Light does not go on for infinity, which if no decay is turned on, that's what's happening. Light is just continually emitting for infinity. By turning on decay, we'll have a hot spot, and then light gradually dies off the further we get away from the light source. So think of a lamp in a dark room. The light is the brightest, closest to the lamp, but slowly it fades away as we get further and further from the light source. The next setting that we could play around with is found in the Shadows drop-down. I'm going to turn on Depth Map Shadows, so be sure to turn on that setting, and that way we'll emit shadows on our object. So now that we've turned on Decay and we've turned on Shadows, let's take another test render to see how this looks. Okay, so see how we have a hot spot with our light in the lower left-hand corner. The light gets softer the further we get away, and we're also creating some nice shadows here in the scene. Now to soften these shadows, we can also use something called filter. This is much like a Gaussian blur found in Photoshop. It's going to filter or blur the edges of our shadow. So anywhere from 3 to 5 is a good filter setting to give nice soft shadows. So I'll store this image and take a new rendering. And here you can see how we get nice soft shadows by introducing some filter to our shadow attribute. Now I'm going to start off by having my light right in the center of the logo. So in my top view, I'm going to move my light to make sure it's right smack in the middle of the I, the heart, the 3, and the D. And this is just going to put a hot spot right on the floor in the center, and that'll help draw the attention from the viewer to my logo. If I take another test render, see how that just emits the light, and you can see that the hottest color is there in the center around the logo. So that's just a good practice to draw the attention from the viewer. Also, all the shadows are kind of emitting away from that source, so creating some nice drop shadows there. So I'll keep that image. And at this point, you can do the same. So now go ahead and create a point light in your scene. Remember, from the creation menu, we can go to Lights, Point Light, and play with the settings. Play with the color, the intensity, the decay. Also turn on shadows and turn shadows off to see the difference between how shadows affect the scene. So play around with the light and find where you'd like the primary light for your logo, and then we'll resume with the project. Alright, so now that I have my first initial light, I can begin duplicating my light and creating a 3-point lighting scenario. And really that's just a technique to light all areas of my logo. Now really this process is a trial and error. There's some theory to 3-point lighting, but overall it's whatever looks best at the end of the day. So feel free to experiment. And if you have lighting backgrounds or a lighting experience, you'll probably feel very at home working in this 3D package and playing with lights. If not, just feel free to explore, and you'll have a lot of fun playing with the lights and the colors and seeing how that affects the final render. Now for the light right in the center, I'm going to give this just a nice cool color. So I'm going to change the hue to blues, and I'll give this just a tinge of blue. And if we take a look at the render, you'll see how this will just introduce a nice cool color to the overall scene. Now one thing, I can see my background is just the default gray Lambert material. I'm going to take my background floor at this time and assign a new material, assign a Lambert. And here's where we could have fun as well. We could have a white background, we could have a black background, we could have red backgrounds, and we could explore with different things. But I'm just going to start with a nice dark background so that the color of my white logo and the orange really contrast and pop off of the background. So let me just pull that back up and see how that dark gray material works. You can see that that really makes the logo pop quite a bit more than what we had just a moment ago. Alright, so now let's create a few more lights. I'm going to keep this image. Now once we've taken the time to set up one light, we don't have to repeat that procedure from scratch. Rather, we could just duplicate the initial light. So with my light selected, I can go over to Edit and down to Duplicate. Also notice that the hotkey is Control D on the keyboard. So if you're trying to remember your hotkeys, you could use Control D to speed up that process. Alright, so we've duplicated the light. I'm going to use my Move tool, hitting W on the keyboard. And in my top view, I'll move this light to the lower left-hand corner of my logo. And then in my perspective view, if I navigate around, I could see where that is. I'll also zoom in my front view and get this a little bit closer to the logo. And with this slide, I'm going to turn down the intensity, and again we can look in our perspective view and in our camera view, so before we even test render, get kind of an idea how this will look. So I'm just trying to create this light a bit softer so that it doesn't overpower the main light that I have in the center, but at least it'll light up this lower corner, because currently you can see that this corner really doesn't have any lighting so far. And then just to contrast the center cool color, I'll start to give this a warm color. So I'll switch over to an orange. And as we're playing with the software, we're also talking about color theory, lighting theory, 3-point lighting. So we're talking about a few techniques to get the best lighting solution for our render. Okay, so we have our second light. Let's go ahead and create a render. Alright, so see how that lights up those darker areas down below the logo. And in this case, I'd recommend maybe even toning down that intensity even more so it doesn't fight too much. We want to light up those areas, but we don't want it to overpower the main light that we have. So you can see that's a little bit softer there. I like that. Now, one thing as we start introducing new lights is we can decide some lights we may want shadows, some lights we may want to turn shadows off. So for example, if I keep this image and render again without shadows, Let's compare. So here you can see that my primary light has shadows in this render, but not my secondary. And in this case, the secondary light also has shadows. So we do want to be careful. We don't want every light to have shadows on, otherwise we'll have shadows everywhere and that may be distracting. So this will be up to your own personal taste. Do some test renders. In this case, I'd say it would look good to not have shadows on with this secondary light. So I'm going to keep shadows turned off for my secondary light in the scene. So now we just need to light up the other dark areas. So if I look around, you can see that this right corner, bottom corner, is pretty dark. So we could try lighting that up as well. So I'm going to minimize my render, select my second point light, and in my top view I could just hit Control D. Remember, Control D is the hotkey to duplicate a light. And then with my Move tool, remember that's the hotkey W, I'll take the Move and I'll move my point light, my new point light, off to the right hand side. Now it's good just to give some variation so that things don't look too symmetrical. So I don't want this to be directly over, so I'm just moving it down a little bit. Maybe I'll move it closer to the logo or closer to the floor. Again, just to give some variety. So having some of that spontaneity will really enhance your render. So as I render again, you can see a bit of a hot spot here. I'm going to get this a little closer to the floor because I want to, in this case, maybe create a nice hot spot on the floor right there. So again, this is really up to your artistic design and what you think would look good with this render. I'm going to take this color and again, I'll change the color a little bit. I'll just warm this color up a bit more. Alright, so you can see a nice yellow hot spot coming in down here. We have orange, we have kind of a blue. Very subtle, but it gives a lot of color variation. Because if we go back, look at what we originally had with just a white light. So here's what a white light does, and then when we add multiple colors, see how it just gives a nice studio lighting look and feel? Alright, I'll keep that image, and just quickly to round off this stage of our project, I'm going to duplicate this light once more, put one in the upper right hand corner, and this light, I'm going to try and get a nice red color bouncing off the scene or the floor here. So I'm going to give a pretty intense red. And the reason I'm doing that is because I have that heart. So what I'm hoping to do is get a nice red color bleeding on the floor here. And if I take a test render here, it looks like we need maybe a little bit more intensity with that color. So I'll ramp up that color intensity a little bit more. Render once again. Alright, so you can see some of those red tinges starting to come in here. I'll move this light down a little closer to the logo. Alright, so see those red colors starting to be represented. So just again play with this, do some test renders, see how it's looking, and there we go, I'm getting some nice color bleeding. So see that red starting to come present on the floor that we didn't see before. So we're introducing some nice reds to the scene to tie in nicely with that heart. So I'll apply that one, and then we'll just create one more cool color up in this corner, and then we'll call this stage good. So I'll duplicate, I'll move over for the eye, move this up. Let me move this one, this red one, over just a bit. And then for this last cool color, I'll introduce a cooler color once more. Bit of a blue. And so I'm just trying to balance having warm colors on one side, cool colors on the other. A hot spot, the brightest light is in the middle. So we're overall lighting up our logo from every direction, but the hot spot, our eye, is drawn to the center of our logo. So at this point I'll keep this image and we'll go ahead and round off this section, stage 3, camera and lighting, and now we're ready for the final polishing and the special effects to really take this render from mediocre to a nice professional quality look. So just to recap what we produced in this stage, we created a background plane for our scene. That way we're able to adjust the colors of our background. We then rotated our scene, so in my case the logo is laying on the floor. We created a camera by using the Create Camera tool, and then we assigned our side view to look through the camera. That way we have our camera and also our 3D perspective view. Once we'd set up our camera view and locked that in, we then played around with creating lights and seeing how light attributes affect the overall look and feel, the dynamic of the logo. So now that we have a good lighting approach, we have things figured out, we can move into the next step of the polishing and the special effects to take this render to that professional quality look. So at this time, don't forget to save your scene. We just finished another stage of the project. So at this point, we completed the third stage of the project and we worked on the lighting phase of the project. So go ahead and save. So once you've completed your lighting, you've played with that, and you're ready for stage 4, we'll then get into our special effects. Here in stage 4, the final stage, we're going to take a look at polishing and special effects to be able to get this final quality. So this is the final product that we'll produce in this stage. And when working in 3D, everything comes together at the very last second. So here we'll take a look at how we can create bevel materials. So this is a blend material that will apply to these beveled chamfered corners of our logo that'll help trace the logo and help that to really stand out. So here we'll take a look at how we can enter into sub-object mode, how we can select bevels using some selection techniques, and how we can apply sub-object materials. We'll then take a look at a special effects attribute within the material such as glow to help this logo really pop. We'll then use an advanced rendering engine tool called Mental Ray. And a nice feature of Mental Ray is Final Gather. That'll help us take us from this quality with our logo to this nice bounced lighting effect where we have a very high quality render. Just to finish things off, we'll use exposure and gamma to be able to fine-tune the colors to get this final quality. At the very end, we'll save an image and see how we can save our 3D file to a JPEG. So the first polishing technique we'll take a look at is applying a bevel material. So the approach we're going to take is creating a nice metallic looking material on the bevels, and that'll really help outline the logo and make it pop. So to do this, we need to take a look at a new tool, the ability to actually select multi-sub-object faces. So getting in here and selecting just the face, not the entire object. So to be able to do this, we need to switch to a sub-object component level, which we can do from our status line, or a more common method is right-clicking on the object. And remember this pop-up menu we saw earlier when assigning materials? Well, here we'll take a look at an additional tool. Here we can switch to what's called face mode. In face mode, we can select the individual faces of a polygon. Now, just so we don't have to go through and click all these little faces, you can imagine how painstaking that would be. Let's find a quick way that we can select these bevels. So here I'm going to use my top view, and I'm going to marquee drag around the 3D logo text. So here I essentially selected all the faces that make up this geometry. Now from my front view, I'm going to select what I don't need, and we can deselect things by holding Control before we make a selection. So I'm going to hold down the Control key on my keyboard and then marquee drag and deselect all the middle faces and bottom faces. So what that leaves me with is the bevel face and the top face that makes up the logo. So the last thing I need to do is hold Control and click on the top faces to deselect those. So now my selection is made up entirely of just the bevel faces. So that's a little selection tip and technique so that we don't have to painstakingly go around and select all the faces that make up the bevel. Alright, so now just like we did before when assigning material, we'll right click, go to assign a new material, and in this case we'll assign a blend material. Again, blends are more shiny versions of the Lambert material, so this will create a more metallic material for us. So for the color, I'll go into the color swatch and I'll select a nice orange color so that it matches the logo color that I have here. So we're trying to match that color. And I'll darken this up just a little bit. And then I'm going to play with these two settings, eccentricity and specular roll-off. Notice how I adjust the sliders, how this adjusts the highlight size on the test sample sphere here. So I'm going to turn down the eccentricity, and I'm going to turn up the specular roll-off, which is basically the intensity of that highlight. So in turn, what we're doing is we're creating a very chrome-looking material. So the highlights are going to be very bright along this border bevel edge. Just to see how that's affected the scene so far, let's come up and take a test render of our scene. So if we look side by side, See how that nice bevel material is highlighting the logo now, and we're getting some nice reflections from our lights taking place on those bevels. So you can see how that material really helped to enhance the overall polishing of our logo. Now let's take it one step further. Here's another cool little special effects tip, and very fittingly the name of this is special effects. So if we hit that drop down in our attribute editor, we can actually add a glow as well. Now be very sparing with this setting because it adds quite a bit. A little bit goes a long way. But you can see how it actually gives a glow to that edge, and that gives a very cinematic feel to our logo. So I'm going to apply just a little bit of glow to the edge just to make the logo face pop, especially where we have that light bloom hitting there. It gives just a nice effect, the glow really happening there. And I can tone that down just a bit by playing with the specular roll-off, the intensity of the specular highlights, if we don't want that to be so bright. So if we want our highlights to be a little bit more dull, by turning down the specular roll-off, that will affect that setting. So the best way to learn how these settings affect the render is really just by playing with these settings. Look at the test sample swatch and then do a test render to see how it affected your scene, and then do a side-by-side comparison to see what that overall look and feel has. So that's how you create a bevel material. Let's go ahead and recap those steps, and I'll just keep that image for later reference purposes. So in our perspective view, we wanted to select the bevel materials. So we selected the overall object, we went into face mode, and then remember the little selection technique. Do a marquee drag, select the entire object, and then use your side views in the 4-view layout to control deselect what you don't need, which would be the middle faces and also the top faces. And that leaves you with your bevel selection. At that point, just go about assigning a new Lambert or a new blend material. The blend will have more of the specularity, where the Lambert is what's applied to the front face, and that will give the nice specular pop. Now, just a little tip. At this point, since we have two materials, we've created what's called a sub-object material, meaning we have more than one material applied to one object. So the right-click material attributes might not work anymore. Here you can see that this tab only gives us the one material. So here's how you can find your new blend material. If you select the object, in the attribute editor, you can scroll to the right, and there you'll see the new blend and the original shader. So that's another way to navigate and access the material shaders that have been created on the object. So at this point, go ahead and pause this video, create those bevel highlight materials, and I'll do the same. I'll repeat the process and apply a metallic material with a red blend here on the heart, and then a white metallic blend here on the bevel of the eye. Once you're done editing in face mode, you can simply select away from an object, or you can right-click on the object and go to object mode, and that will exit you out of the subcomponent, the face mode. Alright, so here I applied the bevel materials to the heart and the eye, and at this time you should have a bevel material on your logo as well. Let's take a test render and see how this affected the overall render. Alright, so now we're starting to get a nice subtle bevel taking place on the eye and also on the heart symbol. You can see that really helps to pop and stand out. And maybe I'll just turn up the glow intensity just a little bit on those effects. Also, what will help is having the light hit these predominantly to make those stand out. So I can take my light in the upper top corner is going to light that bevel right there. So imagine that light standing beside, and as I render now, you can see how that really helps that bevel to pop. So at this point, it's going to be just a trial and error process of moving the lights, adjusting the material attributes. For example, maybe I'll make the red a little bit darker so that this face is not overly blown out. Also the white, you can see that the orange color is dark enough. That's looking good, so I'll need to tone these down. I can also adjust the light intensities, move these around, or try experimenting with shadows on and off. So have fun experimenting with the lighting of your logo, and that's what will really help draw things out. So I'll fine-tune some of the materials and lights, and then we'll take a look at the render that we have, and then proceed to the next step. So I've adjusted my lights and the materials and textures just a bit, and this is the final outcome that I've come up with so far. You can see that we've darkened the ramp texture for the white and also the red, and you can see the bevel highlights are popping really nicely now. Also experimenting with the placement of these lights just a little bit. You can see basically the idea, they're still in the exact same places, just slightly moved. Now, this render is a little dark right now, but I just wanted it to be dark to demonstrate another tool that we can take advantage of. Here in the render view, we can work with the overall camera exposure and the gamma. You can see that the exposure will lighten and darken a scene based on our render, and we can adjust the gamma color, which desaturates or really adds a lot of dark contrast to the render. So this is another tool that you can use to just fine-tune and finesse. So as opposed to adjusting all the lights in the very end, you can finesse some of those settings to get it just the way that we like for our final render. Alright, so now that we have this set up, let's take a look at one last polishing technique. And for this, we're going to use an advanced rendering engine called Mental Ray. Now, Mental Ray is a plugin that comes along with Autodesk Maya, and it helps us to achieve more photorealistic results. Now, by default, we've been using Maya software, and the comparison between Maya software and Mental Ray is like using a quick Kodak camera compared to a professional, expensive camera. We're going to be able to get more photorealistic results with Mental Ray. So I'm going to switch over to Mental Ray, and just a side note, if you don't see Mental Ray in your dropdown, it may just be disabled. You can easily enable this. Sometimes it's disabled by default when you first launch Maya. You can go to Window, Setting Preferences, Plugin Manager. And in your Plugin Manager, if you scroll down towards the bottom, look for Maya to Mental Ray, Maya to MR. Chances are these are both not checked. So check the auto load. This will make sure next time you open Maya, Mental Ray will be turned on, and also turn on loaded. That way you'll be able to use it this time. You can refresh the list and then close the plugin manager. So now you should see Mental Ray in the dropdown. Now I'm going to create a render so we can compare Mental Ray with Maya software. Now the first thing you'll probably notice is that the scene is quite a bit brighter than what we had before. But the other thing you may notice is look at the render time. Before it took 2 seconds, and here with Mental Ray it took 14 seconds. So Mental Ray is much more processing intensive, so it will take longer to produce the image. So that would be one of the downfalls of using Mental Ray. But for the quality increase, it'll be worth it. Now, in my case, I'll just reset the exposure to default right now, so we have a little bit darker scene, so we can compare what we had with Mental Ray and without. And now, let's take a look at a really nice feature within Mental Ray. I'm going to come up to my panel toolbar and go to Render Settings. And there's a lot of settings, and we really don't have the time in this Quick Start video series to look at all of them. But just one setting to show the power of Mental Ray. If we come to the Indirect Lighting tab, let's come down to Final Gather. And Final Gather is something that Mental Ray is famous for. It's indirect lighting, and it'll help to bounce lighting about our scene. So let's keep this image and take another render, and we'll see a hit on the render time for enabling the setting, but we'll also see a quality boost. So let's compare. Alright, so we see the render time almost doubled in my instance. It took 20 seconds to produce the render. So why would we sit through a longer render time? Well, let's take a look at the difference. You can see it's a very subtle difference, but we're starting to get bounced lighting. Before we had dark, hard shadows, and now you can see how lighting is starting to bounce within the logo. So using Final Gather at the very end of the rendering is going to give us a nice, final, polished look for our logo design. Now, finally, I'm going to adjust the exposure to just get a nice pop to the color overall with my scene. So if I darken the gamma to get the colors a little bit more vibrant here, and then I'll drive the exposure, you can see that we're really getting some nice orange colors now, just playing with these fine-tuned settings. So really between working with these fine-tuned settings, working with our colors, our lights, everything comes into conjunction and plays with one another. So it's really kind of a ballet between all these different settings to come up with a nice final end result. And here I'd say we're getting pretty close to a final polished quality for our logo as we come in and finalize on this look and feel. So here we could call our logo complete. Here in the polishing stage, we took a look at how we can create bevel materials. So we selected sub-object materials by going into face mode. We took a look at selection techniques of selecting objects and then deselecting what we don't need. We created bevel materials by using the blend material to create a nice shiny metallic surface, which gave us these nice highlights. We even used special effects such as glow to get those highlights that just pop out to the camera. We then edited the lights and made some edits to the materials and textures so that everything played together nicely. We then enabled Mental Ray, the more advanced rendering engine, so that we could take advantage of the render setting of Final Gather. Final Gather gave us that nice final soft shadows, the contact shadows on my background plane, and gave this nice professional look and feel. We then used the exposure lens and the gamma control settings within my render view to bring this final logo to its final quality. So as we look at where we started with materials and where we progressed over the lighting, you can see how all those little adjustments came around to the final look and feel that gave us our professional logo here. So once we're satisfied with this project, we can save the scene. That way we're able to find it and open it at a later time. So be sure to save this as your fourth and final iteration. And when you're completely finished, you can save as 05 final. That way you know that this is the final version that you're happy with. Also, just having the scene file is the 3D object. We'd like this image that we've just produced. So we can also save our render. So if we go to File, Save Image, we can save this image out as a JPEG, a PNG, any file format, and saving as a JPEG, we'll then be able to share our final product with our friends. So be sure to save your rendering once you're done. In the Save Mode type, be sure to select Save Color Managed Image as opposed to Raw Image. What that means is if you made any adjustments to these settings, saving with the raw image will not save these settings. Saving a colored managed image will save with the way the render looks in the render view. So I'll just name this. Be sure to name it with your initials and then the title of the logo. So this is my Love 3D logo. So I'll go ahead and save that file. Now let's take a look at on our Windows Explorer browser where we can find this now. So if you navigate over to your Explorer file, go to Documents, navigate to your Maya folder, and within your Maya folder you can go to Projects, go to the default project, and then look in your Images folder. And this is where you'll find your JPEG image that we just saved. So opening this up in just a regular image viewer, default image viewer program, we're now able to look at our final product produced in Autodesk Maya. So again, this JPEG is a file that we could show or share with our friends online. So let's recap what you've learned in the last hour of this Autodesk Quick Start Maya video series. In stage 1, we started off with creating the 3D text. So do you remember where we're able to create the 3D text from? Well, if you've guessed the Maya main menu, you're correct. We went to the main menu and we created our text from there. There we were able to output a bevel of our 3D geometry. And we explored tools such as the channel box, our attribute editor. We used the toolbox to manipulate our geometry. We learned hotkeys in stage 1 to navigate 3D space, such as orbiting, panning, and tracking. And we even used the text tool to create symbols such as the heart. So stage 1 was a good introduction to navigating Maya and also creating 3D geometry. In stage 2, we entered into the materials and texturing. So there we took an introductory look at how we can create base material shaders. There we assigned Lambert materials to our geometry, And we took a look at how we can edit those from the attribute editor. We had settings such as color and special effects, and there we also applied ramp materials. So we got into how we can work with normals. So as far as menu tools, we learned how we can use our polygons menu set, how we can adjust and modify normals, how we can work with our UVs to project planar UVs onto our geometry. And by the end of stage 2, we had some nice dynamic material textures applied to our 3D objects. In stage 3, we got into cameras and lighting. So there's where we started to really bring our project together. We created a camera for the scene environment, and we set our camera view up for our final render. We also created point lights in the scene, and we worked with the lighting theory of 3-point lighting to be able to light our environment and play a nice color theory balance between cool colors and warm colors on our logo. And so at that point, we were doing test renders, and this is what the logo was starting to look like at that point of the project. And that brought us into stage 4, polishing and special effects. There's where we started applying blend materials to the bevel edges to really get the logo to trace and pop out from the scene. We even enabled mental ray, which really turned up the quality of our project. And then we played with the exposure and control settings to go from kind of a bland looking render to add some contrast and really draw out the colors to make that pop in the render. And that gave us our final product, this JPEG image that now we'd be able to upload to Facebook or share on a social network to send to our friends. And just a special challenge, ask your friends and your family to give you some feedback on the logo that you created. See if they have any suggestions such as the color or changes that you could make to your logo. And then go back and try and make those changes to improve upon the quality of your logo. That's a great exercise to improve on your efficiency. Also, see if you can go back through and create a new logo without referencing these videos. That's a great exercise to make sure that you understand the tools that we've had a chance to look at so far. So at this point, we hope that you've enjoyed working with Autodesk Maya. This Quick Start series was designed to walk you through step by step on how to work on a project from start to finish. We took a look at modeling, materials, lighting, and finally rendering.